How many shows are you hosting? Are you still doing the
Like
weekend thing?
just Fox and Friends weekend. Come join us anytime, Saturday, Sunday morning. You're welcome. It's
Well,
early though.
look, I know it's early, especially on this coast.
I
You
know.
guys call me all the time like, "Hey, can you join us?" "Sure, what time?" 4:30. Like, yeah. God, you're killing me.
All right, we're rolling.
Well, this is not intimidating at all. Pete has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 flags. I got one
You
and a
got one.
bottle of whiskey. I have another one around here somewhere. Happy Independence Day, my friend.
Likewise, Mike. Thanks so much for having me. Great to see you.
And oh, I didn't even see the flag on your head. I guess I got to count that one too.
Come on, and on my arm. So keep counting.
That's an arm? I thought somebody attached a leg to your shoulder.
Oh, I'll take it. I'll take it.
Did you work out this morning? Be honest.
I did not. The plan is to work out in about 2 hours with my 2 oldest boys and my wife Jen down in our
Hmm.
gym. But I did do a dirty job. Cleaned out the
So,
chicken coop this morning with the kids. Get their hands dirty. That's a dirty one.
dude, you know what? One of the best days of my life was when we finally got permission from a guy who ran a hatchery in Wickenburg, Arizona, to bring the Dirty Jobs team into a full-on chicken hatching operation. Because, as you can imagine, you show up with a team of cameras, at a chicken farm, and you're going to be greeted with shotguns. It was the greatest expression of trust, and I'll never forget that. How many chickens do you own, and
Oh,
for what purpose exactly?
we only have 6 chickens and 9 growing chicks that will soon grow. So we'll have, what is that, 15 soon. But right now we only 6 laying hens
I
and a
love it.
rooster who we have to beat up, and a rooster who
Which
you have to beat up because he attacks the kids.
and you only have the one rooster typically.
Only the one rooster. We did have 3. That was my big mistake, Mike. When I first got, we didn't know we had roosters. We had 3 of them. The ratio was way off. They were very angry. They not enough hens for the roosters, and so they took their aggression out on the kids, and that's when I had to deal with it. Yeah.
People don't really understand. Well, you could make a list of the various ways in which people are disconnected from their food. But in a related Dirty Jobs episode, I went to the Murray McMurray hatchery in Iowa somewhere where we separated the pullets from the cockerels. And you'll appreciate this. It's the pullets that are shipped in the millions through the mail to people all over the country. The cockerels are also shipped through the mail, but at a far smaller ratio. And of passing interest to the casual listener might be the fact that every day tens of thousands of little baby roosters are poured into a giant whisper chopper and turned into mulch, fertilizer, and chicken food. Something for
I
you to share
didn't
with the
know
kids
that.
during your workout. Yeah.
I will let them know that. I now understand why. Of minimal utility in our life. Although we do let them range around the land all they want, and the rooster protects the other ones. That's his
Hmm.
job. That's what he does.
Do you think, I mean, knowing the size of the enormous brain you were blessed with, you could draw some sort of parallel between the plight of the modern day rooster slash cockerel with that of the average man trying to make sense of the environment in which he finds himself?
Well, absolutely, no doubt. I mean, I think we have inverted the relationship, the male female dynamic in a lot of ways that has left men completely lost. You're familiar with not just in employment and in the economy and in their roles, but even within their own families, and within the dynamics of their own relationships. And as a result, they're clinging to vapid, quasi masculine bravado as a replacement for the actual protection, the actual leadership that the companionship they're supposed to provide. Don't get me wrong. My rooster's a bit toxic at times, so that's why you have to deal with him. I'm the real rooster on the farm. Okay.
I get it.
But ultimately, yes, like when you have, if the hen mentality is all that exists, you may have for a time a quite a peaceful moment, but overall you're lacking the duality that nature intends.
Ah, that's it. That's the thing I want to talk to you about, the duality, not just of of family and female and male and all of the confusion that seems to be surrounding that, but the duality of patriotism and what it means to you. You've written this amazing book, and I promise we'll take a deep dive into it. But it is I almost said the 4th of July, which would be accurate from a Gregorian calendar perspective. But of course, it's Independence Day. And, Chuck and I talked about, you know, we're lucky with this podcast. People now pay attention, and we could get pretty much anybody we want. But we wanted to talk to you. And personally, Chuck, you can chime in if you had another agenda, but I've just spent a week just promoting the bejesus out of a movie called Something to Stand For. And I keep coming back to this, to trying to answer the same basic question, which A is what happened from 1998 when America described herself as 70% of America anyway, as intensely or extremely patriotic, to 39% today. I'm super interested to get your thoughts on that, but I also want to try and understand the duality, as you put it, between loving this country unabashedly and unapologetically, but also being able to criticize it with the same level of passion that you do in the war on warriors. That, my friend, is a neat trick.
That was the trick of the book, and it was to. I mean, it is my love for the military, my love for my time in uniform that brings me to this place where I have to be intensely critical of the institution that I love. But I come only from a place of reverence and appreciation of that. I think it's the same when you look at our country. It's what's your default? Is your default
Mm.
appreciation, gratitude, historical perspective grounded in the truth of what happened, an appreciation for God given rights and the recognition of the sacrifices of previous generations? Is that your default when you start to grapple with the sins of our past or our flaws of our moment? Or is your default, we were, sinful from the start, that it was a failed experiment from the beginning? It was built only on the backs of slaves and on stolen indigenous land. And that's only the perspective that we're going to take. And that's a burn it down, tear it down mentality. And we had moments, Mike, in the 60s and 70s, when it was as tumultuous, if not more, than today. Anarchists, assassinations, race riots. It was terrible. But you
Mhm.
still had underneath it, I think, the default assumption, even amongst opponents, that America was a good, great, and special place, worthy of perfection, of a more perfect union. You saw that certainly in MLK and his rhetoric in those speeches. That brought us through those tumultuous times. Now we're at a place, and my book before this one was Battle for the American Mind. It's about the K through 12 takeover, or the takeover by the far left of K through 12 education. We're in uncharted waters in this century, trying to keep a country while simultaneously training up the young minds of that country to, at best, be skeptical and at worst loathe the country they're growing up in.
Mm.
No country in human history that I can recall has done that or attempted to say, we are great, here's who we are, but we want to teach our young kids that we're not so great, and then somehow maintain a trajectory. And it leads you to believe that those pushing that agenda don't want to maintain American greatness or American leadership or American freedom. They have a different agenda. And when you dig underneath it, that's the scary part, is you start to see the real seams pulled apart because the differences are greater than they were in the 60s and 70s. They're more foundational, they're more fundamental, and that makes it scarier.
It's easier, I think, to you use the word agenda to identify a clear and present and conscious agenda, and then you can say, okay, I think that's good or I think that's bad, right? That's one thing. The thing that worries me as much or maybe more is the lack of nuance that I think a lot of citizens are experiencing right now. Maybe it's the cognitive dissonance or the binary choice that we're always confronted with, but it just seems like we're unable to celebrate the progress we've made or express real gratitude or pride for the sacrifices that have been made on our behalf without immediately having to qualify that by saying, obviously, we have a long way to go. Obviously, things aren't perfect. Yes, yes, we were formed by imperfect men who want to blah 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 blah. So it just on Independence Day of all days. Um, I mean, how do you think about it on this day, and how do you qualify your own love of country? Again, especially in light of the fact that you're willing to say so many hard things about it. Does that confuse the people in your world, your readers, your viewers, your enormous family, and your chickens, most especially the rooster?
The rooster lives in a perpetual state of confusion, and rightfully so. That's how I keep control over him. Anything that approaches him could attack him at any time, including me. And the kids know that.
By the way, Pete, I'm sorry. I got to do a quick U-turn. I want people to understand before you answer that question, I want them to understand your family. I want them to understand who you are as a dad and how you're living on a day-to-day basis. You just casually mentioned a couple of your sons. How many are there now
Well,
altogether?
there are 5 sons, 2 daughters, and I took my 2 oldest sons and my youngest daughter were the ones that volunteered to go clean out the chicken coop with me. It's really
Mhm.
because they felt if we got it done, then there is a trip to the baseball card store, which is what they really wanna do, right?
Right, right,
So,
right.
I understand incentives for young people. Yeah, my wife Jenny and I have, a blended family of 7, 3 and 3 and 1 together, and there are 5 boys and 2 girls. And they love each other. And the oldest is 14, the youngest is 6. And they've all been together since they can remember. And we just try to be really intentional about certain things. Like family time is family time. Christ is at the center, and America is a beautiful country. And we will learn about all the failings and failures and qualifiers later on. But first, we're going to pour into the foundation of how grateful we are as children of God and as citizens of this republic to be where we are, and our charge is to go forth and do good things for God and country. So that's what we're trying to build out here, is that ethos, is like learn about our history, learn your Bible, learn the kids are going to Constitution camp for a day tomorrow, put on by
Wow.
Carol Swain. Carol Swain, one of the most wonderful people on the planet, so smart. She texted us the other day, said, "I'm doing this Constitution." I said, "We're going. My kids are going." Whatever it is, we're trying to give them perspective in a world awash and amiss, where most 14-year-olds, and I'm not patting ourselves on the back, we don't have it figured out, but we're allowing the world to infiltrate their minds through a device that is full of qualifiers and lies and deception and propaganda. And we're just choosing to try to be as intentional as we can up front on these big questions, knowing they'll encounter all sides in due time.
I had a chance to meet your wife. Actually, before I had a chance to really meet you, I was over promoting something or other. And full disclosure, Jenny's way up the food chain over there at Fox Nation. And we were
Sure.
out at some restaurant with some crowd of people and enjoying a couple of gin and tonics. And you were somewhere out there doing whatever one of your 8 or 9 jobs, and she was saying he'll make it, he'll make it, he'll make it, and when he gets here, don't feel bad about the G&Ts, he'll catch up with you, it's all going to be great. And
And
you did. You showed up, you caught up, and we had a great conversation
yeah, we did.
about all of this. But you know, I'm not trying to get needlessly personal, but I just think it's important for people to understand the complexity of your family today, the blendedness of it, the fact that you kind of hit the reset button, Pete. And
For sure.
also, I look at your curriculum vitae. People should know that this God and country soldier who loves his country without apology somehow matriculated through both Princeton and Harvard and wound up working at Bear Stearns. Rest in peace.
Rest in peace.
Mm.
So, I mean, dude, and now you got chickens and 7 kids and all of this. So, we don't have to make a meal out of it, but
No,
I do I
no.
do want people to understand that the road to wherever we are today is not a straight one.
It, amen. Yes, and amen. And I'll say that I think we have to have enough humility to know that we don't have it all figured out at any particular point in time, and I certainly haven't had that, and it's been my failures and misgivings that have taught me the most and humbled me and refocused me on what my most important job is. And at this moment, it is as a father and as a husband, and with all the things that matter the most in a world full of shiny objects. So, yeah, we don't know if we're doing it right. In fact, Mike, I was going to write a book. One of the books I thought I would write is Pete's Politically Incorrect Guide to Parenting.
Yeah,
I
but
thought
no publisher's going to put out a 2,000-page book, Pete. They're just not going to do it.
That's the point. I said, "What am I doing here? I'm going to put out a book on parenting. I don't even know how my kids have turned out yet." And so far, So I'm not. After they're maybe someday done something, then I'll wait on that. But the whole parenting thing's a humbling experience, and yeah, it's been a journey. It's maybe I'll write it all down someday.
Well, you should, because I think what people really need to hear more of is the complexity of the modern man. And we don't have like the same lack of nuance that prevents us from being both patriotic and critical of our country at the same time. It confuses people, for instance, to learn that I used to sing in the opera before dirty jobs. It it hurts their brain, and it makes them suspicious of things that I say because we just have it in our head that everything's supposed to line up. You're an anchor on a news network that a lot of people would either categorize or maybe dismiss as right wing. You've got this very complicated curriculum vitae, and I'm just making the point again because I think all of that must surely impact the primary question, which is how does all of that conspire to make you so doggone patriotic?
It does, because I've seen the blessings of a nation that can afford you any opportunity, but is also filled with grace and good people inside a social experiment in Western Christian civilization, which we've lived in a tiny little fraction of, and most of human history have not. And I think a big part of it, Mike, was spending time overseas. You see, you go to Iraq, you go to Afghanistan, you see the way in which other people live, um,
Mm.
dramatically different lives, and in some ways with a lot of things to learn from. Like, I left Iraq and Afghanistan deeply appreciative of the family centric way in which they live, the generational commitment they had to family under a household, and a commitment to honor inside that family in a way that is almost totally gone, it feels like, in our own country. Yet I looked at things like racism or sectarianism and I said, now that's real racism. Okay. What I'm
Mhm.
seeing in Iraq or I'm seeing in Afghanistan, in this tribalism, you come back here and they're accusing us of being systemically racist, and you can step back and say, no, I've seen systemic racism. So I think sometimes just seeing other systems, doing a little bit of your own homework, is goes a long way in having a healthy dose of appreciation and gratitude for what we have. And that, I give that back to my parents. I give it back to the military. I give it back to a lot of mentors who've mentored me throughout the years. And that's why I want to write these books too, is to inspire my kids and other generations, just like you, to love the country first, and then we can debate about how we make it better. But my goodness, in the course of human history, we are in the 0.001% when you look at quality of life and freedom and opportunity. It's not even close between this experiment and anything else.
You're talking about perspective and context and being able to fairly compare the United States with any other form of government out there today, but also being able to look back 250 years and think about those founders and that generation in their time. It's back to the duality you mentioned and the
Yes.
lack of
Yes.
nuance that I mentioned, right? And I'm just so increasingly curious about how we're going to be judged by your kids' great great grandkids, right? When they look back today, which statues are going to be defiled and defaced, which are going to be removed from the public square. How are we going to feel about meat eaters? How are we going to feel about capital punishment or whatever hot button you want to put in there? Are we going to be, are your grandkids going to be able to look at what we did in 2024 in this time? Or will they do what we're doing now when we look backwards and cherry pick and apply today's standards, generations before? I hope not, but it's
It's
kind of
almost
what
an
we do,
impossible
isn't it?
question. It's almost an impossible question, Mike. And the only way I go to answering it is to the extent to which we repent and there is a willingness to honor God in who we are, both in our private and our public institutions. And I do believe that nations have received blessings, and I think we have, especially from the beginning. And we've worked really hard to turn our back, but many are not. And if we are faithful to our founding principles and to where our rights come from, I think we could do an about face and be glorifying God, but maybe not. I mean, he will give onto us what ourselves what when we abandon him, he says, "Have onto your own devices," and that's what leads to some pretty crazy conclusions. I mean, one of the examples of something I hope we look back on and say, "Well, that I can't." You think about what would be the thing you. To me, it would be transitioning kids, chemically or physically
Mm.
transitioning kids. Like, I hope we look back on that 30 years ago, and that seems like the most cruel and inhumane thing I could only imagine. I would never do that. And yet that was some kind of a mainstream conversation these days. There's just, we find our own crazy ways to distort truth in every generation because we refuse to look truth in the eye. And I know that in my life was had a lot to do with the winding roads that I took for a very long time. Is you don't want to look truth in the eye, and when you do, it tells you a lot about yourself. And that's
You
what I'm
talked
trying to do.
about generational inertia, or at least kind of implied it before, and I wanted to ask you about that because so many people who serve come from families who served, but in your book, I was surprised to learn that that's not you. You didn't know the difference between the Army and the Marines when you enlisted. What what happened to you?
You know what it was, Mike? It was back to your subject. It's back to what you're talking about with something to stand for. It was just naked patriotism. It really was. My parents were small town, hardworking people, salt of the earth, blue collar, conservative, but not political at all. Conservative by nature and patriotic. And we went to church on Sunday, and Wednesday night, and then every 4th of July and Memorial Day weekend, we would go to my parents' small town in southern Minnesota. It was a farming town, and we'd go to the Memorial Day parade, and it was a blink and you miss it kind of moment. It was, the fire truck, the one sheriff's car, the high school band, and the dozen vets from the county walking down the street, and that was the parade. But just watching the town stand up and give it a standing ovation, and the reverence that they had. And then watching this, of course, it's Memorial Day. So you go down to Memorial Day Park and you reflect on the men that are not there because they gave their life.
Not
And then just
Veterans Day,
not
Memorial
Veterans
Day.
Day. This is Memorial Day is the one that really sticks with me. And you start to add up, and I wasn't adding it up then, but it's for the visual now. You add up every one in Mingo, Minnesota together, and you start to get a sense of the depth of the service and the sacrifice that required protecting the freedom that we have. But for my small 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old mind, I just thought, man, these guys did something special. Like, what did they do? That seems important. And maybe when I'm older, I could do that. I think I should. You do that and then throw in, I can't even name what it was, but throw in a military movie or two. And pretty soon it's like, yeah, I want to do that. And I didn't know. I got into West Point and Princeton. And you know why I chose Princeton? Because they had a better basketball team. And that's all I cared about. And I wanted to play
Yeah.
basketball in
How'd
college.
that work out, Pete?
I sat the bench for 4 years, but it was great. Uh, but the nice part is I knew that Princeton had an ROTC program, and I didn't know if it was Army or Navy or whatever, but I just said, hey, if I want to serve, I can. Um, that's why I'm a big believer in civic ritual. I'm a big believer in parades and events and ceremonies. And we try to take our kids. We did it this year. We'll do it every year. Um, what we celebrate, what we honor is a reflection of what we value. What do we spend our time cheering for, clapping about, recognize, talking about? That tells our kids what we care about. And my parents just doing that simple duty year after year is what kind of stacked in my brain. Hey, you should do this. And then I did, and kind of the rest is history. But our country for years had been pretty good at doing that, taking
Yeah.
young Pete's who don't have any of that background and saying, hey, be all that you can be. Or, what's the Marine Corps slogan?
That'd be the few and the
The few,
proud,
the
I
proud.
believe.
Yeah, the few, the proud. Like, that's what I want to be. And they did it. And we're losing that. And that's why we've got some of the recruiting challenges we have.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a great pivot. But before we go to recruitment, back to this, back to parades,
Yeah.
because there are going to be parades today all over the place, and there are also going to be protests today all over the place. And I'm well acquainted with the power of language and words and the impact they can have when they're grouped together just right. But metaphors are even more powerful. Visualizations in our minds, right? And these things, these civic expressions that you mentioned, talk more about that and what happens if we forget why we stand, if we forget why we sing along with the national anthem, when we forget why we put our hand over our heart, or why we salute, or why we stand when a woman enters the room, or any of the other little social lubricants that kind of keep us uh, from tearing each other's throats out.
Well,
Why is it important?
you said it so, I mean, the way you said it beautifully. It's important because if we don't do it, we lose it. I mean, just like I think of even the old farmhouse on my property, just about 5 acres from here, which was the center of Main Street 100 years ago, or it was along Main Street, and you can still see the tulips. There's rows of yellow tulips that outline the property. So every year when the tulips are ripe, you can see the footprint of where the old house was. But of course, there's no house there at
Yeah.
all. It's deep in the woods. You have to go kind of walk in to find it. And Jen goes and picks some flowers and everything. Well, that used to be the center of action 100 years ago. That was where everybody. Now we can barely find it, and we have no idea where it was. That's just 100 years. That's 2.5 generations, and that's an example of land. But the same goes with our own civic traditions and our own institutions and our own beliefs and our own patriotism. It has to be. I mean, Reagan said it. It's the line we all know, but freedom is never one generation away from extinction. You don't pass it to the next generation in the bloodstream. It has to be fought for and passed along. That is exactly right. Like, what we did is we gave away, in exchange for leisure, in exchange for convenience, in exchange for technology, in exchange for paying more for, we gave away the basics. We gave away strong core families, fathers and mothers, men and women. We gave away standing when women entered the room, or saluting the flag, standing for the anthem, teaching kids about our founding generation, the brilliance of what a republic is, instead of casually saying we're a democracy, which of course we're not. We're a constitutional republic. What does that mean?
Mhm.
What are those differences? Why do they matter? Why did the founders care? Why did the founders know so much about their Bible? Why did they know all the stories from the Old and New Testament? And what did that tell them about human nature? That human nature is not perfectible. And as a result, we need all these checks and balances and ways to check pride and power inside government institutions, because of course they're fleeing governments where they crushed people of a particular religious faith. All of these things have nuances to them and can be easily manipulated and shaded by new language that sounds a little bit like the original, but really isn't, with people with very different intentions. And so
Mm.
you start by waving the flag and saying, we live in a great country. And from those moments, from those opportunities with your kid, you explain further, you unpack it further, you go deeper. And we've counted on our government schools, our public schools, to do that. They used to do that, kind of. Now we're lucky if our school says the Pledge of Allegiance. If you're in a good school if your school says the Pledge of Allegiance, and if the kids actually stand, then you're really in a good school. That's Think about how far we've come in 100 years, where that was something kids did with reverence, with a slap of a ruler if they didn't. Now, of course, our critics would say, "Well, what was life like 100 years ago?" Well, we know life wasn't perfect 100 years ago for subsets of Americans. We recognize that. We do, and we can hold both beliefs in our mind at the same time, in what America has achieved in making a more perfect union and more equal for more people. So I just think we need more moments to hone in on the special nature of the country and then have those conversations at the micro level. And that's where my light bulbs have gone off. Like, Pete, yeah, you work in news and you do this, but the only 7 souls that matter that you're charged with are your 7. Train them up so that they will not depart from it when they are old in all the things that you believe in. Because if you've gained all the fame of people knowing your name on Fox News, but your 7 kids are socialists now who, dump the flag, then what are we doing here? What are we doing? Then I was a net negative to the contribution to the country. And I think for fathers, for men, for women, that's a wake-up call in our society right now, because you can't count on the residual of other institutions to reinforce these things. You have to do it, and then hopefully in return we reinvigorate the institutions that we've lost.
Yeah, I think you're referring maybe to the 1,000 points of light that Bush talked about and
Sure.
and and
Yes.
and,
Yes.
and got a lot of
Yes.
guff for, but that's what it is. Does it
Churches,
have
Boy
like
Scout groups, civic groups, all those things that were there that have sort of faded into vanilla and don't stand for anything anymore.
well, they've I mean, what I want to ask you about is the advantage or disadvantage of being on the right or the wrong side of cool. What is cool for your kids? How do you make patriotism cool? How do you I mean, looking back, Chuck has heard me talk about this all the time because he had a front row seat for it. The Boy Scouts were not cool when I was in the Boy Scouts, but they were also transformative. That was the first time an adult made me raise my right hand and take an oath, a pledge. I mean, obviously and there's so many. At least there used to be so much military tie into the Boy Scouts. In fact, my scoutmaster was a retired lieutenant colonel. The troop was exactly that. It was a series of patrols and so forth, and all the nomenclature. And people made fun of me in high school, but I felt like I was a part of something kind of cool, even though I knew I was on the outside of cool. It was the same thing with barbershop harmony. It was the same thing with doing plays, finding that core group of people and making connections. Um, so I think you're absolutely right. I think the grout in the wall, in the brick wall, it's the grout that's starting to erode. And of course, the wall can't stand without the grout. And so, how are you going to keep your kids engaged? How you going to make it feel cool to be patriotic?
It's a good question. I think being patriotic will soon be is already in some ways countercultural, which is always a little cool with the kids. This is where the anti-American sort of woke side of things, secular side of things, has overplayed their hand, and they really have nothing to show for it except angst and standing up and saying no, and no, I'm proud of our country. You've seen it. You've seen it with some young people in a rebound of support of patriotism, not overall, but especially amongst young men. And I don't want to get political because the point is not to make it about Trump or Biden, but you sort of this instinct of I'm not the bad guy just because I'm a white guy, or I'm not a bad guy just because I'm a male, or I'm not a bad guy. You don't want it to go to the bad extent of some sort of a racial identity, but a healthy extent is I'm not a bad guy for being an American. I'm an American and I'm proud of it. And that's a damn good thing. And I stand with my forefathers who fought for my freedom. That in some ways is and has become countercultural. It's not good because we're on our heels. I also think, to your point, Mike, I don't know that you need to try to make it that cool. I mean, a lot of the basics just aren't that. I mean, but at the same time, when it's done right, when it's done well, it can be cool. Take Maverick. Take the
Right.
latest Top Gun movie, which
Yep.
we watch with the
Hi-
kids, and they're ready to
Hire
be fighter
that
pilots.
gang and put them in charge of recruitment.
Exactly, 100%. Absolutely. Just whoever did that, put them in charge. Or, on the religious front, like a series like The Chosen, which is so well done, and watching our families watching, and trying to imperfectly, but we're doing a good job watching an episode of that a day as we read the book of Luke. And
Mhm.
and as they start to kind of see it and read it and see it and read it, like none of that's cool for a kid who's 14, but when that's what your family does, you don't really have an option. And oh, by the way, you soak it in and you take it in and you start to understand it in more meaningful ways. So I think sometimes when we try to make things too cool, we end up making them a little bit look too much like the world that they're not supposed to look like. And the whole point is that's not what we do. And I think parents should be less afraid of looking uncool and more afraid of saying, well, maybe if that's cool, then I don't want to be a part of it because that's not how we operate. And I know that's not easy because I got kids that can sing pop music, and I'm like, what are you singing? I mean, there's
Right.
the osmosis of things is real, but trying to fortify them to say you don't get your cool score from what the world tells you or what pop culture tells you. Here's the core of who you are, and you're cool just being you. And I know that sounds sort of like it sounds sort of lame, but I don't try to present it anything other than just what's good and right and true. And hopefully, in the end, they see that as being pretty cool.
And history plays a part, though, right? That's why
Oh
I
yeah,
think this book is really important that you've written. But that's also why when I when I saw people kneel for the flag 4 years ago, the first thing, I wasn't angry at them so much as I was baffled. It's like you guys must not know that the national anthem is a protest song. It's like the original protest song. You know, do do you do you not know that it was a drinking song before that to Anacreon in heaven? This is not the thing that you want to sit or kneel for, and I don't think you would if you actually understood some history behind it. So I agree with everything you're saying. I would just put this umbrella of curiosity over top of it. It's
absolutely.
important. It's important to be curious about the past because if you're not, then I think you're going to be indifferent about the future.
And then it's really easy to be deceived about the past as well. And so, yes,
Mm.
whatever content we can find to feed our kids that gives them a fortification in history is truly important because history is being rewritten on a daily basis from with people with very different agendas about how they want to represent the country. You're exactly right, Mike.
So that was your last book. This book is scary. Honestly, it's excellent, but at its heart, you're basically saying that the erosion of a meritocracy has infected the armed forces to the same kind of degree it's infected higher education. When I think, for instance, that the average graduate from Harvard finished with a GPA of 2.56 back in 1955, as opposed to 3.99 today, right? You, I mean,
Well, the kids are just so much smarter today, Mike. You
Yes,
have to
Mike.
obviously.
understand.
So if the kids are not exponentially smarter, then our standards have exponentially changed. And it felt to me reading your book that that's the heart of your critique. The meritocracy that defined the military has abdicated.
That is the heart of the critique. It is if there's one institution that we as citizens ought demand be completely based, other than the airline industry with pilots, be completely based in or any number of highly specialized skills, be completely based on merit. It's the United States military, and for our sons and daughters joining, we ought to have full confidence that the institution they're joining, which could send them to war and ask them to die, is doing so in a manner that fully protects that life and gives them every advantage to win no matter what. And that was the ethos for the most part of the military that I joined. It wasn't perfect. I also joined a lot of mixed multi-ethnic units because I was in the New Jersey Guard and different units, and racial animus was not an issue. It was not. I mean, would guys razz? Sure, like anything. But this was a team devoted to a mission that loved the country and wanted to serve. And our best performers were elevated into leadership positions, and our poorer performers were relegated or pushed out altogether. And that's what it's supposed to look like in a fighting force. And just over time, you started to see political prerogatives being pushed from the top that weren't focused on standards or accountability or meritocracy or lethality, but on sort of social just, politically correct priorities that wanted to make the military look a lot more like civilian society. And there was, as the book lays out, Mike, there was a role the military has played in, say, racial integration, and it did it better than anybody else, earlier than anybody else. And once black men were serving alongside white men, those white men realized there was no basis for their racism because they were equals with the black men they were serving with across the board. And so it served that healthy function. But really, in this story, it started with women in combat. I mean, it started before that, but more or less, it was this idea that politicians and political ideologues at the end of the Obama administration wanted to solidify women in all combat roles. And that's when, with very little fight in the Army and the Air Force, with some fight in the Marine Corps, and I have immense respect for the Marine Corps, there was pushback to say, well, let's test this and see if women joining combat units make them more effective. And of course, the studies showed, I mean, bone density and lung capacity and muscle difference, it's all that the all male units performed much, much better.
Talk about
But
that study, Pete, because it was extensive and it was incontrovertible, and yet somehow or another, it was roundly ignored.
it was mandated. It was extensive. It was incontrovertible. The evidence was overwhelming. The amount of injuries that females had, and this was a unit of 400 men doing extensive field exercises versus a unit of 300 men and 100 women integrated in those field exercises. And women were injured at much higher rates. Their ability to maneuver on the battlefield was much lower than men. That unit was much less ready and capable. And yet, even when those results were presented, the Marine Corps, the Secretary of the Navy, Ray Mabus, and others did everything they could to contort the language to make it sound like there really wasn't that much of a difference. They went so far as saying maybe these 100 Marines aren't representative of all women. So this sort of dismissing the whole idea that you could have a sample size, or a
Right,
control
right,
group.
right.
So it's just, and ultimately, Obama wanted women in all units, and they wanted to be able to put that statement out, and they did. And what hasn't happened. First of all, what hasn't happened is men and women haven't changed, right? So we're the same. But what has happened is, instead of keeping standards high and allowing women to compete for them, standards have been forced down formally or informally by commanders and admirals and others who are under political pressure to say, well, why don't you have 15% of women in this military MOS or this military job? And that question is not a question, it's a suggestion, which leads to, they don't say the standards are changing, they say the standards are evolving, which of course means they're just lowering.
Wait, wait, wait. When your commanding officer asks a question or makes a suggestion, that's just fancy talk for an order, right?
Correct. So the whole thing, nothing's written down, nothing's told, but the whole thing is, well, I think, are we doing enough to make sure that we have enough women in the Ranger battalions? Just think about that. That's a signal. That's an order. Things change. And we didn't even include all the stories on there. The reason I knew this book would get a big response from vets and those serving is because I spent a whole 6 months talking to dozens and dozens and dozens of them across all the service, actively serving, anonymously, willing to talk to me. Just one guy put me in touch with another all over the different units, different ranks, and they all sang the same tune. They said commanders are walking on eggshells because standards are lowering. There are new classes of who's in and who's out, who's up and who's down, what the Army wants, what the Army doesn't want. And then, of course, you had the COVID vaccine mandates, and then you had what happened on January or in the summer of 2020, and then on January 6th, and then you had the political view that my own story comes in there. But it all sort of mushes together to create an unhealthy environment, which is distracted from its core purpose, which used to be, we find the best dudes, put them together, go kill bad guys. And now it's all these other boxes we need to check, which creates animosity or skepticism or reticence, or, hey, was that person promoted for the right reasons or not the right reasons, which means that person is impugned either way. And it's maybe fair to them or unfair to them. All things you can tolerate in a Harvard faculty lounge, not things you can tolerate in the 101st Airborne when their job is to get dropped behind enemy lines.
And yet, you're saying that that's precisely what's happened.
I know for a fact that's what's happening. Absolutely. It's what's happened and is what is actively ongoing and happening.
The difference, of course, being if things get completely bananas at Harvard, and it would have to get even worse than it is now. If people truly look at Harvard and see the $52 billion endowment, see the plagiarism, see the real attitude and philosophy among the faculty, see the credentialed inflation, if they add all that up together, right? I mean, eventually the donations will stop, and companies will stop hiring Harvard grads, and that degree will lose its prestige and become little more than a receipt. And parents will eventually get the memo, and the ship will have to turn around. And that's a hell of a consequence for the leading educational institution on the planet. But the stakes are so different here. They're so different. And in a top-down organization like the military, I I mean, how do you turn this ship around? What needs to happen
Well,
to get the rot out?
that's a big benefit, Mike, is that it is a top-down run organization. So in my last book, Battle for the American Mind, it's about the K through 12 education system, which is nationwide and oftentimes run state and locally, even though it's a ton of federal pressure at this point. The military analogy I use for my readers was it's time for a tactical retreat. You need to get out of those government schools, save your kids, find an alternative where you can fortify them, vote with your dollars, vote with your feet, change. You can't do that with this. There's only one Pentagon. There's only one
Yeah.
Secretary of Defense. So in my argument in this book was, no, this needs to be a frontal assault right back at what's been done to this military from the top into the bottom. So at the top, it starts with you need a new commander in chief. You need a new commander in chief who won't tolerate woke nonsense in the military, who will hire a Secretary of Defense, who will pursue the basics of what the military is supposed to do. You hire a chairman of the Joint Chiefs and other chairmen who none of which have been invested in this sort of, whether it's the gender stuff or the DEI CRT stuff or the environmental green tanks nonsense, any
The
of that,
electric tanks I
the
read about.
electric tanks that, it's by the way, I have a friend who's making an electric vehicle for the military, but he's doing it on the side because the military won't contract with him because the military only wants 100% electric. And his thing is, well, I want to give him a hybrid that can go diesel for 95% of the time, but then for special operators can go electric when you're within 500 feet of your objective and you want to be silent. That sounds good to me. Like,
Well,
that's a
yeah,
good
because
application of
there's a
technology.
tactical advantage and not a
Yes,
virtuous
exactly.
advantage.
But so you find all the people that were most invested and you fire them. You say, you're done. You say, if you want to do this, you're out. You push them out, you age, whatever it is. Um, and you reorient the priorities in a top-down organization. You say, we're getting rid of DEI, getting rid of CRT. We're going back to the standards, whatever they were in 1998 for the infantry and across other combat arms roles. And we're going to hire the guys that made Maverick, and they're going to do our ads for us. And then at the end of this book, I wrote a letter to my sons, which is how I wanted to close it. And I'll tell you, Mike, I waited until the book was written to write that. So I didn't write that until the end because I really didn't know. There were some parts in the intro where I alluded to it, but I didn't know what I was going to say, whether I would actually recommend that my kids go into the business of the profession of arms. And ultimately, I came out with the conclusion that I would like them to serve, because if you want to rebuild this military, you need patriots coming from the bottom up too. And if not the Hegseth boys, then who's it going to be?
Here's the paragraph that got me. And this, I mean, folks, there's so much in this book that is like truly important, like critical. I- it, this is a guy who's been there and done it, who's ringing the alarm bell, and I just think that it's super important. But this is my favorite part. You're basically writing a letter to your boys 10, 15 years down the road,
Correct.
right? If my boys are going to raise their right hand and put the American flag on their shoulders, I want them where it matters, where real decisions are made, and where meritocracy, for the most part, still reigns. Service to country, with God in your hearts, will take you places and teach you things you will never learn anywhere else. You will be forged, you will be warriors, and you will never regret it. You will join another brotherhood, an elite brotherhood. This is all following up your advice to join the SEALs, the Rangers, the Green Berets, the Marine Raiders. They're still they're they're still fundamentally a meritocracy, but you're saying the rest of it is fundamentally not.
I am, and that comes from, my experience and my interview with a lot of guys. Now, hey, these special operators, a lot of them tell me they're coming for us too. Like they don't want any aspects of the military not conforming to the social justice sort of woke aspect. But for now, those are the places where, because of the high intensity and the risk with which they undertake, the missions they undertake, they strip a lot of the nonsense out. And so that was kind of my compromise, where you say, hey, yes, I want you to join, but if you do it, go all the way, because I want you, where I know you'll be surrounded by people who are there for the right reasons and because of the right reasons, and not because of political prerogatives for the most part. But yeah, it's because conventional units, that's where it's
Yeah.
easier to push this stuff. And that's where they've started.
How are we to feel patriotic, though? Just I mean, 1% of the country wears a uniform, if that, right? I mean, it's a very small cohort. And we look at what happened in Afghanistan, we look at the
Yep.
withdrawal, and we hear, these forever wars, which I'm not really sure is a fair characterization, but I get it. There's no it just feels like the lawyers are fighting the wars, and you guys were never really properly unleashed. And so, what happened to Sherman's observation that war is all hell, and the faster that's made clear, the sooner the war is over. And it just feels like we've tiptoed into so many quagmires. And if is that tiptoeing and that pussyfooting, is that a part of this same thing that you're warning us
Oh,
about in the
Oh,
book?
big time, because I experienced it. I mean, we fought a 20-year war 1 year at a time, 20 times over, which is certainly a different ethos than they had in World War II, and it was fight to the end, fight to the finish. Um, it Take Israel, for example, right now, what Israel's facing. I mean, they're going to end up having to fight Hamas for years and years and years longer, because they weren't able and willing, for whatever reasons, whether it was political pressure, internally or externally, to just finish the job on them from the beginning. And that's one of the, I can't remember what chapter it is, but I basically take on international rules of engagement and international law, and in addition to sort of the micro aspects of what I saw, and said, why are we fighting wars based on what, like, Europeans in the 1920s thought we should do in mahogany rooms about what the laws of that war are, when they never conceived of what we're up against now, which is where all of our enemies use our laws against us on purpose to perpetuate wars endlessly, and then try to make us look like the bad guys while they put civilians up in front of them to try to get them killed as for propaganda value. Either we brutally demolish our enemies and crush their spirits and their willingness to win, or we will continue to fight those enemies time and time and time again. I mean, that goes all the way back to Joshua. I mean, there's this, these are things we've
Jericho, right?
always known. Um, yet we've gotten too smarty pants for our own good, and that the lawyers started to decide what's good or not good. And that's why I worked so hard with President Trump on pardons of a number of these guys who I thought were unfairly impugned for things they did on the battlefield. It's pretty easy to second guess from an air conditioned office in Washington. It's a whole other thing to be the guy in the middle of the night in a foreign country,
Who
facing down
specifically
bad
are you
guys.
talking about, Pete? What who
I
how
didn't
many
include
of
much of
those
this in the
pardons
book,
were
but
issued?
there were, Matt Goldstein was an Army Green Beret. Clint Lawrence was a first lieutenant in the Army. And then Eddie Gallagher was a Navy SEAL. And then there were 4 contractors called Raven 23, who were Blackwater contractors, all of which had different dynamics and situations, but ultimately killed bad guys in a manner in which somebody politically didn't like. But it was all very mischaracterized. And I brought each of their packets over time to Trump over the course of his presidency, and he ended up pardoning all of them. It was his own decision at the time. And I wrote extensively about why I have the back of warfighters, even if it's done imperfectly. And I think we just perfect this. We expect this clinically sanitized, no civilian casualties. Everything's going to be perfect. No one's going to get hurt. Everything. It's just not how war operates, and that's unfortunate. But if we try to do it with kid gloves or with surgical gloves, we're never really going to get rid of, actually exterminate the enemies that we need to defeat, to create a peace on the other side. And so you get this idea of, quote, endless war, which I do think is unfair too, Mike. I don't think it's a fair term, but I can understand why people come to that.
I I mean, and we're so disconnected from the military itself.
Big time.
We don't have any skin in the game. And I'm not saying, oh boy, World War II, that must have been great, when gas was rationed and sugar was impossible to find and rubber and blah, 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 blah. But at least everybody knew there was a home front and it was a united effort. Now it just seems so strategic, almost like a chess piece. And and I wonder if that is also contributing to the overall worry that informs your book.
For sure. For sure. I mean, and politicians don't have any stake in it. So, up or down doesn't affect their lives one way or another, other than how politically popular the war is. And that's, I blame Republicans for that too. I mean, George Bush said, let's win the war and go shopping. The best thing you do is go shopping. It's sort of, I understand that mindset, but we never really galvanized people in a way that connected them to the conflicts in a meaningful way. And there will be another conflict. And that's kind of the scary part of the next level of the conversation, playing it forward is, okay, Mike, we did 9/11 on the backs of, decades. Even if our public schools weren't perfect, they were still mostly patriotic. And so we had this immediate response to, hey, let's do something. And then we can have the conversation about if what we did was right and everything. What happens in 2024 if there's the border's wide open and some sleeper cell from Iran or wherever else commits some terrible October 7th type attack inside our own country? Are we immediately divided? Is there a large portion of our country that says, well, we kind of deserved it? That's a scary thought if you play that forward, as to
Depends
how
who's
you
in
conduct
office,
a
maybe.
long scale war. What?
I said it depends on who's in office. I would
Yeah.
think, I
Yeah.
mean, look, I imagine the extent of the disaster you're alluding to would be more galvanizing if the disaster were more, comprehensive. But you're right. I mean, if something goes awry now as a result of an illegal immigrant or a cell coming together, I suspect a lot of people on the right side of the aisle are going to say, "Look what you did. You let him in."
Yeah.
And
I mean,
and
or that is true. I didn't, and or even if it wasn't, like, in whatever avenue it came from, there's always going to be politics played about, well, why that happened or who let him in or what. But it's almost it was a universal, who's this bin Laden guy? Let's go kill him after 9/11. It was that sense. And I don't
Mhm.
know that we muster, regardless of what the blame is, who's this guy? Let's deal with this. Let's address this. And not that everything we did after 9/11 was right, right? Maybe we'd have to restrain that impulse and not get pulled into something bigger that we spend billions and trillions on. I mean, that's a whole nother conversation. But back to patriotism. Patriotism is pretty important when you're asking young men to wear a uniform and go die for a country. And we're missing recruiting goals because the military basically pulled a Bud Light and decided to sort of try to cater to non-traditional constituencies. And in the meantime, they offended all the boys from Oklahoma and Kansas and Texas who normally join the military. And they're like, well, I don't
Yeah.
want to do that. If I want to do that, I could go to the local university. And so it can be turned around inside the military, and it has to be, because you can't move away from this problem. You can't, move to a different school or a different tax rate. This is our only deal. And if my kids, if the Hegseth family says we're not going to serve, and then we're a pretty good barometer of the type of family which has been pumping some patriotism for a long time. And if they're a hard pass, then forget about meeting recruiting goals. And then you get into scary end of empire stuff where you're saying, well, okay, we need to insource troops or outsource that activity to other people
Call
because
the
our people won't
Hessians.
sign up.
Or
All that stuff.
conscript,
Yep.
Yeah.
draft.
Yeah.
Yep.
Or draft.
Or
And then you got a
draft.
whole different conversation. Oi. Well, then, as we start to land the plane, how does what can the average citizen do, and how can the average citizen think and engage in a clear-eyed way with the reality of the challenges that we're facing, and with this understanding that, look, patriotism, not to conflate it with PR, but you've mentioned recruiting a couple of times, and I do think it's an important thing to riff on for a moment because it is PR. It is a message, and there's a difference between the army saying "Be all you can be," or oh, what did they? An army of one. That's when it went off the rails for me.
Mm.
Yes, yep, an army of
Like, what
one.
do you mean an
It doesn't
army
even make
of?
any sense.
Like, what the hell is it? Where's unit cohesion? Right? Where's the? I mean, isn't the whole thing baked into? Look, you're going to take a lot of your qualities and a lot of the things that make you you, and we're going to put them in a box. We're just going to put them over here for a while
Yes.
because that doesn't matter. Okay, here are the things that matter, and now you've got something in common with everybody who's around you. So I think the army of one was nuts. I think be all you can be was a bit inward looking. I think the Marines had it right for the longest. And it's probably not for you. The few, the proud, you know, right?
Hmm.
That that was aspirational. I don't know. What's the Navy saying? Let's go on an adventure. Let's take a sail.
It's probably
Let's
not
that's
better. Navy's
what can
usually
we
far behind.
so I
Um,
guess if I have a question and all that, it's like we can't just hire the Maverick guys to do it. We have to we have to articulate some great truth that makes people uh, feel good about responding, that challenges them, not entices them, right? People need to be
for
challenged.
sure. I mean, especially when you're talking about young men or the types of and women, but mostly men who are motivated to do these types of things. They want to be challenged. They almost want to be confronted to say, can you do it or can you not do it? Can you cut it or can you not cut it? And images like we saw in Afghanistan or images like we saw from other things make them say, well, I don't want to be a part of an organization like that's involved in that. Um, but to bring it all full circle, I think all of us get frustrated as we watch Fox News. You want to throw things at the TV and feel like the end is nigh, or what are we doing here? And my message for people, whether it's education or the military or patriotism, is always find out what more you can do inside your home with your kids and your grandkids, or your neighbors, or your community, or your friends, or your church. What are you doing with that group of people to pour into them, to remind them to be aspirational, to do something more, to appreciate the country, to love God? It ultimately comes right back at you. We have to look at ourselves before we think there's some sort of a big government solution to it. And then, yeah, we've hopefully we're able to train up that 1 or 2% that's willing to serve. That's always what it's been, Mike. It's never been the majority. It's always been 2, 3, 4% of Americans that stand up at critical moments and say, I will raise my hand and I will fight and I will serve and I will chart the course and I will lead. And I still think we have those men and women out there. You just have to tap into them. You just have to remind them. You meet those people all the time. I get the chance to talk to them all the time. They're not in Washington, D.C. They're not in television, but they're out there and they're tough and they're strong and they don't take BS and they love the country and they know their place with God. And if someone would just motivate them or lead them in a way where they felt compelled to be a part of it, they can be galvanized again. It's not as if we're at a moment where all is lost and every man is wearing skinny jeans. Like we got them out there. They're still out there. I've met them. You met them.
Oh yeah.
And we have to earn their respect and their trust to want to invest in institutions they feel betrayed by and their parents feel betrayed by. And so that's going to become a leadership question. And if that leadership can change that ethos, then I think we've got a fighting chance.
And in the meantime, just for Joe Blow from Idaho and the average citizen, I think you're right. It's a macro problem, but it's a micro solution. And the
Yes.
things you can do, go to the parade, you know, sing loud. It doesn't matter if you can sing or not. If they're playing the anthem, sing along, Chuck. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do know what you're saying. I think it's about storytelling is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Dennis Prager talks about this on the 4th of July. He says we all should be having 4th of July Seder's, like Jews at Passover tell the story. And he suggests that at July 4th, that's what we should do, is we should tell each other the history of our country, why these men were great. That's why your movie is so good, Mike.
Well, and that's why this book matters, because in the end,
Oh man.
look, gratitude is a choice. You know, it's not
Yep.
it's not skin
Yeah.
color, it's not your star sign, it's not your blood type or any of the other things you can't control. Anybody can choose to be grateful for the guy you just described, from Texas and Oklahoma, and who's still willing to go all in. This has nothing to do with politics and everything to do with acknowledging the existence of that biped and what he's willing to do and how we benefit from it. So
Yep.
that
Love it.
that's the baseline for me. Everything else you've said and everything else that's in this book, bro, it's a call to arms to all of us, but to hold our elected officials accountable and to not wait. We can wait for things to go splat at Harvard. We can wait even in our public education system, which is that critically important. Couldn't agree more. But we can't wait on the military. The, it has to be a meritocracy, vicious, unapologetic, full-throated, a joyful meritocracy. That how do we do that? We have to.
Yep.
Don't know
And
how.
and completely nonpartisan, apolitical, just fidelity to the Constitution. That's it. That's all we want. We love the country. We're willing to fight for it and die for it for anybody of any political persuasion. And Mike, I want to thank you for reading the book. I can tell when someone does an interview and they've actually read it, so I appreciate it.
You're welcome. I recommend it to all of you. The War on Warriors. Full disclosure, it's going to piss you off. It's going to make you angry. It's going to frighten you a little bit, but there are times that we need to be frightened because that precipitous decline in patriotism that we talked about early on, I can't prove it, but I think it's linked to the decline of the meritocracy in our armed forces. I think we know in our bones that we need them on that wall.
Yeah.
And we don't care what color they are. And we don't, there's a long list of things the average American does not care about. But the things we do care about, we care deeply. And uh, if this book is a wake up call and a reminder to all those things, is it already number one, Pete? I don't even know. I should have asked you at the
It
outset.
was it thankfully, but yes, it was number one for 2 weeks straight. It's number two right now. Number two right now. Yep.
Well, take it from a guy who knows a thing or two about number two. Um, this should be number one. The great Pete Hegseth. People can see you now. How many shows are you hosting? Are you still doing the
Mike,
weekend
just
thing?
just Fox and Friends weekend. Come join us anytime, Saturday, Sunday morning. You're welcome. It's
Well,
early though.
look, I know it's early, especially on this coast.
I
You
know.
guys call me all the time, like, "Hey, can you join us?" Sure. What time? 4:30. Like, God, God, you're killing me.
Just give
Uh,
us once every 6 months or something, Mike. We'll take it.
Deal. Good luck with the chickens, the rooster in particular. Say hey to Jenny, and
I will.
I'll see you in Sodom or Gomorrah.
See you soon.
All right.
I'll see you again soon, brother. You got it.
All right. Adios.
If you like what you heard,
And even if you don't,
won't you please,
pretty please, subscribe. Well, I hate to beg and I hate to plead, but please, pretty freaking